October 4, 1918. A muddy ravine in the Argonne forest in France. A U.S. Army sergeant with shaking hands is closing a small aluminum capsule onto the leg of a small, dark pigeon. The dugout around him is full of wounded men. The shells coming down on top of them are not German shells. The shells coming down on top of them are American. The note inside the capsule ends with one sentence. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The pigeon's name is Cher Ami. He is the last bird the battalion has left. 8 days earlier, the United States Army had launched the largest offensive in its history, the Meuse-Argonne. 1.2 million American soldiers advancing on a 60-mile front into a forest the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying. The 77th Division was an East Coast division, mostly New York City boys, a lot of them recent immigrants who were fighting for a country half of them couldn't yet vote in. They called themselves the Liberty Division. Inside the division, the 308th Infantry was commanded, in part, by a quiet 34-year-old New York lawyer named Charles White Whittlesey. Whittlesey was not a born soldier. He was a Williams College graduate. He read books. He spoke softly. He had been a corporate attorney before the war. The men in his battalion were almost a perfect cross-section of immigrant New York City. Italians, Irish, Russians, Poles, a fair number of recent arrivals from the Lower East Side who, 6 months earlier, had still been working garment trade jobs. On the morning of October 2nd, his battalion was ordered to advance. They advanced. They advanced faster than the units on their left and right. By nightfall, they had pushed about a mile into German territory, and the German lines had quietly closed up behind them. Roughly 554 men dug in against the side of a steep ravine. Almost no food, very little water, limited ammunition, surrounded. History would later give them a name they never gave themselves: the Lost Battalion. For 5 days, they held that ravine. They held it through small arms fire. They held it through grenade attacks. They held it through a German flamethrower assault. They held it on rations stripped from the bodies of their own dead. The Germans, on the morning of October 5th, sent in a captured American officer with a flag of truce and a written demand for their surrender. The German note was by every account polite. It informed the American commander that further resistance was hopeless. It assured him that any soldiers who came in would be treated according to the rules of war. It was, in tone, the kind of letter you would expect a senior German officer to write at the end of October 1918, when senior German officers were quietly aware that they were going to lose the war and were starting to think about how the surrender narrative would read. Whittlesey, by every reliable account, did not respond. The legend says he told the messenger to go to hell. The legend is almost certainly louder than what he actually said. What he actually did was put the note in his pocket and ordered his men to keep firing.
The men were past the point of choosing between options. They were operating, by Whittlesey's own later writing, on a kind of stunned forward motion. Wounded men were being moved into the lee of the slope, where the small arms fire was at least intermittent. The dead were being stacked. The water in the canteens was gone. The single small spring at the bottom of the ravine was, by the second day, in the open under German fire, and any man who tried to crawl to it got hit. They had 2 ways of talking to the rest of the United States Army. They had runners. The runners, on a flat ravine with German machine guns on 3 sides, did not come back. And they had 3 carrier pigeons. The Signal Corps had been training carrier pigeons for years, donated birds, British loft stock. Each one was tied, by training and by instinct, to a single home loft, miles to the rear. You released the bird flew home, always. On the morning of October 4, the American artillery, working off bad coordinates, began dropping a barrage on top of Whittlesey's position. They were aiming for the German lines. They were 1,000 yards too short. Whittlesey wrote a message. He clipped it to the leg of the first pigeon. The first pigeon went up, cleared the trees, and was shot out of the sky. He wrote a second message. The second pigeon went up. The second pigeon did not make it home either. He had 1 bird left. The bird was a black check cock. The Signal Corps handlers had named him Cher Ami, dear friend in French, the way handlers do. Around 11:30 in the morning on October 4, 1918, a sergeant cupped Cher Ami in both his hands, lifted him out of the dugout, and threw him at the sky. He cleared the trees. He climbed. The German rifles on the slopes around the ravine found him quickly. He was hit, hard, somewhere over the German lines. He kept flying. The handlers at the loft, 25 miles to the rear, knew he was coming because they had been told he was the last bird out. They had been waiting at the perch. They had been watching the sky. The day was cold and overcast. There was light artillery audible in the distance. There was very little wind. A handler named Sergeant Omer Richards had volunteered to be the one on watch when Cher Ami arrived, in part because he had been the man who handled the bird up the line 2 weeks earlier and felt, in the way handlers do, responsible. By the time he reached his home loft, 25 minutes after he had been launched, Cher Ami was, by any reasonable understanding of biology, supposed to be dead. One of his legs had been nearly shot away. It was hanging on by a torn ligament. The aluminum message capsule was, miraculously, hanging on with it. His breastbone was shattered. He was blind in one eye. There was a hole through his chest you could see daylight through. He landed wrong. The handlers ran. They unclipped the capsule, in pieces, from what was left of his leg. They opened it. They read the note. One of them got on the field telephone to the artillery batteries. The American guns went silent within the hour. It would take 3 more days for the relief troops to fight their way to Whittlesea's ravine. When the relief reached them on the evening of October 7th, of the 554 men who had gone in, only 194 were able to walk out under their own power.
But they walked out. And they walked out, in part, because of a 1-pound bird with a shattered breastbone who would not stop flying. The Signal Corps did not let Cher Ami go. They put him on a ship. They sent him home. Army veterinarians built him a small wooden leg. They fed him by hand. He was, very briefly, the most famous bird in America. The French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre with Palm. He was photographed with generals. He met soldiers. He died on June 13, 1919, in a small wooden cage at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, from the wounds he had never quite recovered from. His body was preserved by an Army taxidermist. He is, today, in a small glass case at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., perched on a wire, with a small wooden leg in place of the one he lost over the Argonne. The display, when you stand in front of it, is smaller than you would expect. Most people who walk past it do not realize what they are looking at. The information card is short. For 100 years, the museum cards called him She. In 2021, scientists at the Smithsonian and the American Ornithological Society pulled DNA from a feather in the case and confirmed what the original Signal Corps records had actually said all along. Cher Ami was a male. Major Whittlesey was given the Medal of Honor. He went home to New York. He went back to his law practice. He did not, by every account of every friend he had, ever fully come back from the ravine. People wrote him constantly, asking him to retell the story. They wrote him from churches that wanted speakers. They wrote him from chambers of commerce that wanted dinners. They wrote him from mothers, asking what had happened to their sons. He retold it. It cost him something every time. In November of 1921, 3 years after the Argonne, Whittlesey boarded a steamship in New York bound for Havana. He had been one of the official pallbearers 2 weeks earlier at the burial of the unknown soldier at Arlington. Friends who saw him at that ceremony said he was by then a man visibly worn through. On the second night out, somewhere in the Atlantic, he stepped to the railing of the upper deck and did not step back. His body was never recovered. Captain George McMurtry, his second in command, lived another 37 years and rarely spoke about it. The men of the battalion held quiet reunions for the rest of their lives. There are things in the historical record that don't lend themselves to commentary, and the flight of Cher Ami is one of them. A small bird, badly outclassed by everything in the air around it, kept flying because flying was the thing it had been trained to do. About 400 men who would otherwise be dead were not. That seems worth remembering. If forgotten corners of American history are your kind of story, the next one is already in the saddle. I'll see you down the trail.